Good morning and welcome to our first talk of the day. Buffy currently works at Canva as a security engineer. Born on a moonless night in an undisclosed location along the cyber ley lines. For the past 5 years, they've been using the mystical powers handed down by generations to tame pythons and gophers, manifesting themselves into the security engineer they are today. They also have the best speaker bio of anyone. Buffy's going to use pretty much all the time today, so if you have any questions, keep them in mind and ask in the hallway tracks after the talk.
Hi everyone, I'm Buffy. Today I'll be walking you through 3 different societies, exploring their success, failure and perseverance, and drawing parallels between these empires and modern security culture. I'll also be providing a set of tools to help you identify modern day issues in your company's security culture. Which brings me to Collapsology, a transdisciplinary study of risk that results in the collapse of empires. And just as a heads up, today we will be talking about some of the toxic parts of workplace culture, so that might bring upon some bad memories for some of you. Our first stop today is the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which at the time was the largest empire in the world. It was located in the Near East and had control over modern-day Lebanon, Syria, parts of Turkey and Egypt. The empire was established in the 10th century BC and ultimately collapsed in the 7th. So let's take a look at one of the key influences that resulted in the fall of this empire and lessons we can learn from their failure and what we can do to prevent the same fate. So, after the death of the king of Assyria in 631 BC, there was a lot of political instability and ongoing civil war between many of their occupied territories as they fought to gain independence from their rulers. The rulers of the time even wrote about their fear of internal danger, palace intrigue, and rebellion. What made management's situation worse was that the Assyrians gained most of their territory through a show of military dominance and were notorious for resettling conquered people to other areas within the empire, which resulted in pockets of resistance. So while most modern organizations don't collapse after the murder of their CEO or grow by placing armed militia outside corporate headquarters, we can still see modern-day equivalents of palace intrigue and rebellion. In the modern day, these types of political threats occur when interests and agendas collide in a way that has an impact to the organization's ability to operate, and this is the same for security teams. One of the most common political threats I've observed is turf wars, when managers or employees engage in competition for bureaucratic control of resources or the advancement of individual or organizational goals. You've probably seen in the organizations you've worked in where silos or particular managers stand above the decisions of security, or decisions are completely undermined. In other cases, security management might even cease to exist, or it may be relegated to a small security team with no authority to enforce the security decisions. When I was a pen tester, I would see turf wars play out on onboarding calls, where the team in charge of provisioning access would challenge or cause delays in getting started because they didn't like that another team had procured penetration testing. When I moved into governance, I saw obvious signs of turf wars during risk assessments, when the security team would lament that security objectives were being sidelined for product delivery even when there were clear drivers. The result was always the same though: low risk acceptance with slow-moving security programs, a large and highly risky security backlog with a prevalent shadow IT problem. The other threat that appears when talking politics is vendor bias, and this can be anyone providing goods and services, so that also includes open source. This threat can take many forms, from consulting companies pushing products that aren't adequately matched to the company, to organizations that swear by a particular vendor or hate a vendor to the point that it becomes a detriment. It also takes the form of organizations refusing to buy a product because there are similar open source variations, forgetting that you can pay in other ways. And while there is some accountability required by the businesses seeking out vendors, it can be very difficult to get unbiased information if you have a small or inexperienced security team, and this is the same in consulting. The outcome of vendor bias, though, is rational security decisions are being held hostage by forces that might not be fully articulated or understood by the business itself. You may end up having to devote resources and budget to workarounds to get technology to match security requirements, and security teams might actually deny themselves the best solution because they've decided that they dislike the provider on personal grounds. Internally, the organisation will ultimately find itself behind the curve on skills and innovation by continuously supporting vendors out of either a sense of loyalty or animosity to the competitor, rather than sound business analysis, which it can be a difficult debt to pay. Now, there isn't much hope for the Neo-Assyrian Empire turning things around at this point, but for organisations now, you can reduce the likelihood of these political threats manifesting in similar ways. So the first tool we're going to look at today can help you identify that political back and forth. It's called the Competing Security Cultures Framework, and like its name suggests, it can help you explain the conflicts and competing priorities that often create security risk and failure, especially those brought on by politics. But don't be fooled, it's not a cure-all, and the framework doesn't pretend to fully describe or explain every organisation's culture. It's a tool for learning and exploration, so people working within the context of an organisation's security culture can learn more about it, assign terms and concepts, and identify areas of risk that emerge when security priorities and values come into opposition with one another. In summary, if the Assyrian Empire was a modern business, we can see how their management style would have incited turf wars as management looked to serve their own goals. And by looking at how they left newly occupied territories unmanaged, we can see how this would have encouraged smaller teams to make biased vendor decisions, leaving their security team underskilled and looking after impractical security tools, and most likely resigning in droves. I also think that they would have had a massive shadow IT problem as smaller teams work to maintain their efficiency. For you though, the Competing Security Cultures Framework can be used to help identify these political issues by providing you with the ability to describe and interpret the different ways that politics is impacting the security culture. In the next section, we're going to look at some of the successes achieved by another empire and what a highly reliable culture can look like, and how we can identify similar qualities in our own organisations. So by contrast to the Assyrians, the Romans succeeded for nearly 1700 years, and while they did eventually collapse when Constantinople was taken by the Ottoman Turks, Rome's republican institutions left an enduring legacy, influencing the Italian city-state republics of the medieval period, as well as democratic republics. The Roman Empire evolved from ancient Rome and was founded in 27 BC. We're now in southern Europe, where the Roman Empire had contiguous territories through Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. So let's take a look at what distinguished them from the Assyrians and what tool we can use to make sure our organisation thrives like the Roman Empire once did. So, as I've mentioned, Rome is what I'd like to call a high reliability empire. They maintain complex political structures with a constitution, detailed laws, and elected officials such as senators. However, unlike other empires of the time, it wasn't as top-heavy, and instead they deferred to people who were closest to the issues, which helped them increase social mobility. The Roman army was also known for their sensitivity to operational activities, working to balance the political outcomes of the empire, a process of diplomacy backed by the threat of military action, and their military engagements in order to defeat the enemy when needed. In the modern day, though, organisations that embody similar qualities are called high reliability organisations, and while they have less reliance on military presence, they have continued to adapt to their dangerous and hostile environments that they operate in. The qualities possessed by these types of businesses can be grouped into 5 principles that explain the qualities seen in the Roman Empire, but also distinguish normal businesses to these highly reliable ones. Firstly, there's a preoccupation with failure, and in most organisations, failure is universally a bad thing that's to be avoided at all costs. But in these highly reliable organizations, there is a drive to identify these failures at all costs and as early as possible, using small controlled failures as a tool that can be used to avoid larger disasters. Like the Roman Empire, there was a reluctance to simplify, but that's not to be mistaken with complex is good. Highly reliable organizations maintain a healthy respect for complexity and unpredictability of their environment and seek complicated answers backed by observation and data. And like their military, there is a sensitivity to operations. HROs put equal emphasis on the tactical requirements that make strategy work, and leaders don't just do the vision thing, leaving everyone else to hammer out the details. Instead, they focus on gathering data and knowledge from a variety of sources to make the links between strategy and operations, which helps drive their success. The next two qualities are a commitment to resilience, and high reliability organizations know that they'll experience failure at some point. And instead of worrying about that, they put time and effort into imagining how these failures will occur and what they should do when it arrives. And lastly, there's an ability to defer to experts. And so while hierarchies are important to highly reliable organizations, they aren't when they are a hinder to people. So they focus on skills and judgment of the people who are closest to the systems in question, gathering data and feedback as close to the source as possible. And so that brings us to our second tool for today, the security force behavioral model. And this measures the qualities we just discussed and maps them back to a security program, allowing the business to transform a typical security program into a highly reliable version of itself. This transformation can help businesses reduce the number of large security failures and improve recovery time from them. But a high reliability security program isn't a label that the security team can put on itself. It's something that it does. It's similar to duck typing. If it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and has the DNA of a duck, it's most likely a duck. This model just defines what it means to be a highly reliable duck. So there are two parts of the model, the first being a survey you can use to assess whether or not employees, not just the security team, believe the organization has a high reliability security program. The survey is made up of 25 statements divided into the 5 sections, each representing a value that we just discussed. Respondents are asked to state their level of agreement with each statement, from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And like the competing security cultures framework, it is a generalist tool, so it's very flexible in its application and how results can be charted. And because high reliability security programs aren't typically seen in organizations where security is highly centralized and isolated, if you use this survey, it's really important that you cast the net as wide as possible to make sure that you get a good mix of opinions, not just the ones that'll give you good results. The second tool is a set of measurements for each of these values. It's made so you can gather data regarding how well you actually embody the behaviors in practice. The metrics measure things like the number of security failure scenarios developed in the past year, the average time to organizational decision from idea inception to actual rollout, and the number of security-related training opportunities provided to people, and so on. These metrics are designed to assess high reliability security program related traits and compare them over time. So as you chart them, the metrics will basically tell a story of behavioral change and artifact creation, providing empirical evidence that the organization is actually changing behavior rather than creating artificial artifacts to tick a box. I decided that if the Roman Empire was a modern business, it would be a story very similar to that of Codespaces, who offered developers source code repositories and project management services using GitHub Subversion. They had been operating with great success for about 7 years and had no shortage of customers. But in 2014, they had their Amazon Elastic Compute Cloud Control Panel breached and ultimately destroyed by hackers. And so much like the Roman Empire, where they embodied high reliability and success in some ways, when they took away the ability to be adept at failure or practicing that value of resilience, it's very easy to see a once thriving empire topple overnight. Because high reliability security programs are less about how organizations succeed at security, and at the core, it's actually about how they fail at it in very particular ways and under very specific circumstances. So a majority of security programs, even very mature ones, will often find capabilities are strained when it comes to failure because they rely on being robust. Unlike the Roman Empire, though, you have the security force survey and metrics to drive change in habits and behaviours, adopting new ones that will make large failures less likely and to help your team respond better and faster. So far, we've explored how the Assyrian Empire fell because of politics, while the Roman Empire had limited success because they embodied only some of the qualities of a high reliability organisation. We're now back in the modern day, and the empire we're actually going to look at is yours, and we're going to look at what the future could hold if additional security threats go unchecked, and how we can identify them before it's too late. Now, I'll make the safe assumption that you've had some sort of interaction with security in some way, whether that be with security engineers, governance and risk teams, or security consultants. You might even be the security person or make up a larger security team. So as we go through this section, I want you to analyse how security decisions you've been a part of have been made, or how decisions you've seen being made have been handled, and see if you can see some of these threats lurking in the background. Now, the security culture collapsologists can't be sure how successful your organisation will be, because the nature of collapsology tends to be retrospective. But we can heed their warnings to try and avoid similar fates. We can do this by understanding how employees at your organisation view the security culture and look to explore this territory, identify threats, and treat them to ensure that your security empire stands the test of time. One of the most common and threatening logistical threats I've observed is incompatible outcomes. And I say that it's the most threatening because it regards strategy. For example, how bring your own device policies are introduced or managed, or how organizations migrate to the cloud or introduce new features into their product. When strategy is managed properly by involving people closest to the problem, and when there's a mutual understanding and respect for opinions, the threat of incompatible outcomes becomes largely mitigated. But when product delivery isn't properly balanced with security and privacy controls, especially when imbued with political, emotional, and psychological threats, they can grow into serious security issues, promoting shadow IT, people circumventing security controls, and a lack of accountability with lots of finger pointing. And not even large technology companies are immune to this, as we saw when Apple introduced client-side media scanning, which concerned a lot of security and privacy experts, and Slack tried rolling out its private message anyone feature that was quickly rolled back over privacy and harassment concerns. In your organization, this could also look like sales team promising clients new features without consultation, or engineers rolling out features without security or privacy sign-off. And it's a very common and ubiquitous problem. It's also seen internally when governance teams enforce controls on employees without any regard for the impact on workflow, which results in users relying on shadow IT to get the job done. This threat degrades businesses to a point of creating a sense of false choice, where every concession to the business is seen as a loss for security, and every security initiative is seen as a blow to business efficiency, instead of being treated as joint outcomes that bring value to everyone. But logistical threats aren't the only ones we need to worry about, because we have emotional threats, specifically fear, uncertainty, and doubt, which I think is something that resonates with a lot of people right now. When working as a consultant, it was as common to have clients call about the latest security news cycle, whether it be SolarWinds supply chain breach, a principle of vulnerability, or the exploitation of public remote desktop services to ransomware businesses. The media's ability to spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt is ubiquitous, and it can have a major impact on a business's ability to establish and deliver a long-term cybersecurity strategy, especially when it's captured leadership's attention. And it's not to say businesses shouldn't address certain risks as they become public, but it's not an effective way to run a whole program, and each risk should be weighed up and, if needed, the roadmap adapted. So while it seems attractive to point to the rising cost of security breaches as evidence that we need to spend every moment and every dollar on improving security, it's an incompatible outcome when running an effective business, because features won't ship and it'll be easy for a competitor to start providing better services. Fear and uncertainty can become an excuse for security teams to say no as well. It'll block every piece of innovation, driving engineers to circumvent security to get new ideas off the ground. So if these emotions are allowed to rule, it can make unreasonable security decisions seem perfectly valid and justified, which can make managing security on a daily basis a lot harder. The last threat we're going to look at is a psychological one, and it's a big one with lots of dimensions. It's bias. It can be introduced by generation, education, geography, or culture, and not just at an organisation level, but also at a national level, and each takes a particular way to resolve. The duress it causes becomes more apparent when leaders aren't sufficiently managing differences in how people process information, interact with technology, learn, and approach their own knowledge gaps. A really common example is in communication style, which can be exacerbated by culture, gender, role, and education. We also see these differences discussed in how we as an industry write job descriptions, blog posts, and engage people in discussion, generally with a lot of domain-specific words and with a heavy sense of contempt, which can limit who can be included, but also who feels included. And we can't forget the impact that the Dunning-Kruger effect has when someone starts to overstep their knowledge and offer up advice on areas they know little to nothing about. The threats posed by bias can be difficult to resolve, especially if people aren't willing to acknowledge it and management is complicit in encouraging it. But we have one more tool up our sleeve to help us chart these threats: the Security Culture Diagnostic Survey. It provides a means of visualizing the tensions between information security stakeholders, priorities, and values that exist in every organization, and map back onto the competing security cultures framework we discussed at the start. Keep in mind, like a lot of cultural-based things, I can't tell you how to read the results, and the survey isn't going to tell you what's going right or wrong, because culture is a very relative and contextual thing. But it will help you understand how cultures can co-function and collide. The survey is made up of 10 questions, each with 4 responses that align to the 4 quadrants of the competing security cultures framework, with questions corresponding to the key organizational activities that influence and are influenced by norms and behaviors central to an information security culture. When you go through the questions, you might also notice that a lot of these questions don't mention security, and that's deliberate. Security culture is about how hidden assumptions under the surface influence how we do our job, not how the security team looks at security. And so the response choices allow the respondent to differentiate between the relative importance of stability and standardization, external validation and review, adaptability and freedom of choice, and having a sense of shared community and responsibility. When graphed and overlaid with the competing cultures framework, you can see what the perception looks like when compared to reality. And the thing that I love about this survey is that it's so versatile, and depending on how the results are charted, you can tell a million different stories. To the right, you can see how the results of an organization-wide survey can be mapped onto a radar graph to show which factors people see as the most prevalent and where there might be room for improvement. So in this section, we looked into the future and saw how unmanaged logistical, emotional, and psychological threats can manifest and what outcomes they can result in. Logistical threats impacting how people interact and craft strategy, emotional threats defining how we assess emerging security vulnerabilities and handle them on a day-to-day basis, and psychological threats affecting every aspect of how we interact with the people around us and encourage groupthink. But the security collapsologists have armed us with a tool that can help us identify these things in the form of the Security Cultures Diagnostic Survey, which asks respondents to express how they see key security operations balanced by the business. This gives us a chance to map out and present a plan for the future. So we've talked about a lot of different tools and what they can do to help us, but how does it fit together? The Culture Framework and Survey gives us a top-down view of the security culture, allowing us to orient ourselves amongst the organisation's values and assumptions. It tells us areas of competition and cultural risk. It also allows security leadership to look at where the organisation currently is and decide if directional change is needed, but it won't tell you how to make this change because there is no one way. And using methods that work for one organisation can have a devastating effect on yours. In comparison, the security force behavioural model is designed to provide a bottom-up perspective, analysing how security behaves in practice and influences how this translates to group-based values. This behavioural analysis is important because as an organisation can't redefine its security culture by only changing behaviour, it also needs to understand the drivers behind them. At the same time, the organisation has to have some idea of what behaviours to look at and improve if it's ever to know whether transformation is going to be successful or not. And this consistent cycle between culture and behaviour is at the heart of the relationship between the Competing Cultures Security Framework and Survey and the Security Force behavioural model that we discussed. Influencing culture requires a lot of work to get right, and as they say, Rome wasn't built in a day or by one person. And so depending on the state of the existing culture, there could be a lot of work, and there might even be pushback from your co-workers who value the status quo or managers who benefit from existing power imbalances. So if you're the primary advocate in an unhealthy culture, it may not be possible for you to change much, and that's not a failing on you. Before starting though, it's important to make sure you have the capacity to manage those internal and external expectations, and to make sure you set firm boundaries about what is and isn't possible. Once you're ready to take on the job of influencing cultural change, I challenge you to go and talk to your engineers, developers, and designers about what problems they see with security. Don't argue with them, don't justify these behaviours, just listen. Focus on their needs and critically analyse how security is impacting them and start monitoring that, informally at first. In most cases I've seen, security often loses out in decisions where the decision makers are far removed from the people who have responsibility for security. And so part of this job is to bring those decision makers back into the fold and to help get buy-in into a project like this. And once you have that, you can start to measure and analyze the security culture to a level where you know enough about it and how it works to make changes that will stick and collect metrics that demonstrate these changes have stuck. Culture requires someone to look around and identify those behaviors and threats that have bared witness to the rise and fall of empires. And it's things like this that undermine every decision that we make without knowing it. It's the reason management protocols like RDP end up on the internet, and even on the good days within the best companies, these factors are still a massive force, which is why culture is one of the biggest security threats that will face the industry. It will persist regardless of code analysis, firewalls, and third-party assessments. I'm Buffy, this is Collapsology and This is Collapsology and why your biggest threat isn't exposed RDP. Thank you and have an amazing conference.
Thank you so much. That was such a great talk. It was really good to get to sit here on the sidelines and watch the whole thing. If you have any questions for Buffy, please jump into the hallway chat. Buffy will come in and out. And I just want to say, yes, ducks are very cute. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you again in about 15.